Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. If democracy begins in conversation, then we need to nurture a culture where ordinary people like us routinely talk about those things that help us understand each other, whether it's about climate, race, religion, gender, or politics. When we're trying to make sense of our city and the world we live in, every question comes with a set of assumptions about the nature of ourselves and our place in a larger world. The Conversation Lab provides a safe place to talk about some of those things. This program is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver. It's available on air and online on various platforms, and we appreciate the help of Vancouver's community groups. Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. Kimberly Nemrava joins us today. Kimberly is recently retired from the Canadian Red Cross Society, where she served as Vice President for British Columbia and the Yukon. Being no stranger to emergencies and disasters, it's no surprise to find Kimberly has shown up in Innoweave.
I needed a break, and actually it was really fabulous to have a break, and because it just gave you a different perspective, right? It was as I was leaving Red Cross, as much as I appreciate and admire that organization, I felt a lot like, man, there's a big world out there, and you get used to the fact that you're just caught in one organization's perspective. And so I had a really nice break and just really didn't do too much other than just sort of recalibrate, I guess is a way to put it. But then when the pandemic hit, it was just like, yeah.
Do you think that if COVID-19 had not materialized, that you would have gone back to work?
Oh, yes. I was planning to do something. I had no idea, I was planning to be more active. But I think I just, when COVID hit and when I just, I'd see people interviewed or I'd talk to people and they were just going through what I'd seen so many times before, it just made it.
When I was thinking of an introduction for this program, I was thinking of you are known as somebody who's spent most of your career dealing with disasters and emergencies. I guess that's a good thing.
Well, and it's the neat thing that I love about this is that what we've done is recruited a bunch of mentors who have a whole bunch of different experience in different types of disasters. So we've got Becky Denlinger, who's the former deputy minister, comes from that government perspective of how government mobilizes and how much it's changed over the past years, with BC really being an area that didn't have a lot of disasters to having to call a state of emergency twice within 3 years, for maybe even 2 years. Because I think they did state of emergency for the fires, and then they did another provincial state of emergency the next year, and then of course pandemic state of emergency.
Sure.
And then you've got people like Jean Slick, who runs the Royal Roads Masters in Emergency and Disasters, and she just who worked in the Asian tsunami, and then and you've just got this, and we recruited a lady by the name of Kate Moran, who's the CEO of Oceans Network Canada, which you don't think, okay, that isn't really responding to disasters, but it turns out that she was on an advisory team to Obama for the Gulf oil spill. I mean, talk about intense, talk about having to make those decisions on the fly around things that really the experts say for years that you should be prepared for this. But the reality is that very, very, very few organizations, communities, and individuals are prepared for these things.
Why is that?
Because they're living life, right?
If you've just come by, we're speaking with Kimberly Nemrava about Innoweave. So do we put it on the back burner? Do we shelve those potential plans?
No, I don't think so. It's interesting because I look at that and then I look at organizations like Red Cross, but other organizations and even departments of government is after they've been hit by these disasters multiple times, where you see the organizations that are well prepared is where, in my mind, one thing that I've observed, it's when the leadership has said, we're not going to wait until the next major disaster before we prepare again. What we're going to do is we're going to integrate it into all our work. And so just a really simple example, I remember at one point what we had is in our normal human resources policies, you'd have your policy, and then we actually had a clause in there many times that said, in case of a major disaster response, this is how this policy shifts. So things like hours of work is that you'd have your usual hours of work in non-response time, and then in disaster response, these hours would be shifted in this way, but would still have these limits. And so it's sort of like, I often liken it to the way right now in schools, we would never send children to schools that didn't regularly practice fire drills. And that's just become integrated into the work and preparation of that school. And so I think as we move ahead with earthquake preparedness and pandemic preparedness and these type of emergency preparedness, it needs to become just more part of the usual work.
Just for clarification, our relationship began with the Red Cross, and I watched you for years lead preparedness throughout different communities in British Columbia and the Yukon. So I know that you're all about preparedness. You did take some time off, and you're now with an organization called Innoweave. Can you catch us up on how that happened and what the attraction was to Innoweave? And, of course, what is it?
Well, this is actually run by the McConnell Foundation, McConnell Family Foundation out of Montreal. And Innoweave it's a very creative platform that they offer where they provide support to not-for-profit organizations in terms of strategic planning, social sector, finance, entrepreneurship within the social sector, and a whole bunch of other things. When I approached the CEO of McConnell Foundation about this, sort of crazy idea of trying to provide some just-in-time resources to the sector, many of whom would be going through their first disaster of this scope, he immediately identified that they've already got this well-established platform up and running. And so he suggested linking it to Innoweave. And they have been amazing. As I say, they already have the platform up and running. So adding the mentoring stream to the coaching stream, they already had a lot of the protocols ready. They said it was the fastest stream they've ever added to anything at any time. But they already had a lot of the protocols, so we just worked together on it. So it's a nice match. McConnell is, of course, it's being a foundation that supports organizations nationally. It's bilingual, but it also does a lot of amazing work in the Indigenous sector. And so, with Indigenous people. And so it was a nice match.
So does the foundation particularly coach and mentor not-for-profit organizations and the people that work in those organizations?
Yeah, I can send you the link to Innoweave, and you'll see that they've really got multiple streams. And for this response, they've actually ramped up, the coaching that's available and also some just-in-time resources. So they did 3 things. One was the Leading Through Crisis stream. See, it started March 27th. So it's just been over a month. The second is the ramping up their coaching. And the third is they've done a really good job of curating some of the many resources that are open to not-for-profit agencies.
I guess I'm curious because, I've read a couple of articles lately. One was Globe and Mail, the other was Charity Navigator, who are concerned because of COVID-19. They fear that 1/3 to 50% of the not-for-profits in our country and the U.S. will likely have to close their doors by the end of the year. So it seems like the services and the mentoring and the coaching that you're offering is timely.
Yeah, I think I haven't seen that statistic. Certainly, there's a lot of organizations that are having, every organization, quite frankly, is reevaluating where they're standing and how they can continue to survive. And so it's certainly affecting everyone. But it's also a time for organizations to maybe consider some of those partnerships with other organizations or by linking with each other to really focus on their priority work. So there's no doubt that it's going to be a tough year. I did a webinar several times on just that sort of going into the disaster mode. And one of the things I did try to emphasize without being naive or Pollyanna is that, these disasters and emergency situations are also opportunities to do things that in a non-disaster state, people may not have been open to. Crisis is the mother of invention. Is it crisis?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is. It suddenly you think about things differently and go, why don't we do this together? Why can't we work together on this? Why can't we look at ways to do things differently? And so it does provide that. The disaster does provide that opportunity. And we've seen in different disaster communities, you see organizations coming together in ways that may have taken 3 or 4 years to put together. In non-disaster times, it takes 3 or 4 weeks or 3 or 4 months.
So I guess that's a nice change. I mean, it's a horrible way to be forced together, but adversity does bring out the best and worst in people as well as organizations. So I know in the downtown east side, there are over 50 not-for-profits that are working together during this crisis. So while it's heartbreaking on one hand that there's a crisis and a need, it's really a joy to watch these organizations collaborate.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, one of the things was, I was often asked, why on earth do you work in disasters? Like, how negative would that be? But in reality, you see much more of the best of people than you do of the worst. And oftentimes I think that the reason the worst, that horrible situations are reported is because they're relatively rare. And people are just horrified when they see that, because what happens is how much people are coming together and helping their neighbors and helping each other out and being creative. It's, again, I'm not going to try to downplay in any way how serious this is, but wow, some of the examples of humanitarianism and partnering and innovation are exceptional.
Well, I think every not-for-profit is challenged these days, because if their work involves dealing with a local community every day, it's hard for them to now have that face-to-face contact with their local community. So that chain or that connection has been broken. So how do you repair it? And I have to believe that there's lots of people working for not-for-profit organizations asking those questions.
Yeah, and coming up with really creative ways of reaching out. And even, there's nothing that replaces that face-to-face for people. But the number of people who are taking more time just to reach out to people, to try to connect with them, is making a difference.
Are there any stories that you can share that give us some insight into the kinds of questions you get asked?
The type of things that we're hearing are, and this was important, I think one of the things that people may have been surprised by was that when the pandemic hit, each of us in a way need to go through a grieving process. Mm-hmm. Because when the crisis hits, your former way of life is lost. And for those of us who have been through a lot of disasters, you're in some way you're familiar with that because you see it. But I was talking to a couple of the other mentors, and they were talking about that sort of period of shock and grief. Even the different stages of grief, where you're in denial, and then you're angry, and then you're those things. And so I think one of those things that was noticeable is that particularly for people in leadership roles, although this affects everyone, is recognizing that when something like this hits, there is a period of grief. And part of just recognizing that, I can't imagine, I think of Fort McMurray right now, who's been through the fires and then hit by the floods nearly 4 years later to the day. It's just what that community must be going through is just crazy. But each time you have a real jolt to your community, there is a grieving process. And a friend of mine who is in a leadership role said one of the hardest things for her to get used to was that she's used to having most of the answers. Her job is to have the bigger picture, the bigger perspective, a future-looking focus. And although she doesn't know the future, because she studies that and is on top of it, she has a little bit of she has